We're here to talk with John Sokolik, who has a background in evolutionary ecology and plant systematics research. On the industry side, he's directed cultivation at several commercial cannabis facilities and run large-scale extraction operations. Today, we're looking at what crops like hops, tomatoes, and lima beans can teach us about growing better cannabis. So you've mentioned that cannabis growers like to think their plant is exceptional. What do you mean by that? And why is it a problem?
I think that they think the properties of cannabis are just they're so much different from other crops and plants that you have to treat it differently. And while it does have some exceptional properties, it does behave very similarly to other crops. If you look closer and find some other analogies from other species that are either closely related to cannabis or not, you can find a lot of similarities that do apply. You'll kind of find out that it's not so different from other plants.
For example, you compare cannabis to hops. How closely related are they?
Hops is in the same family as cannabis. It's in the family Cannabaceae. Cannabis would be called the type genus of the family. I think there's over 20 some species in Cannabaceae, but there's 3 plants in Cannabaceae that are commercially cultivated, hops being probably the second most common one behind cannabis. There's just a lot of similarities to hops as cannabis, not just the flavor. Anyone who's enjoyed an IPA and smokes weed could tell you that there is a lot of similar, you get that skunky aroma that you can get with cannabis a lot. But if you look at the cultivation, you see hops grown kind of differently than I would say a lot of plants with a similar habit. Like if you look at grapes, for example, it's another kind of woody vine, but you see them growing in kind of hedgerows. But hops, if anyone has ever driven, along a hop farm, you see them growing on these like long wires. And I think I looked at that and kind of asked, wow, well, why is that? Why do they start growing hops like that? And it's because hops really likes a strong or like a really intense light going through its canopy. So these farmers actually saw more benefits from growing their hops, not necessarily just in a flat canopy, but they got better production from allowing more light penetration and growing them on these long vines, I guess, or long strings. And that really increases just the light acts as the canopy.
I think that really lines up with the popularization of under canopy and inner canopy lights. I know from direct controlled experiments I've ran with these, with lots of historical data as comparison, that putting in under canopy lights raises yield by 30% to 35% for most cultivars. It's really impressive. You have to think, when you think about those gains and the difference, that there was something going on before that was definitely not optimal. The lower bud sites were getting a lot less light than they could productively use. And I think it kind of lines up to what you noticed about hops growers and how they weren't packing in plants quite as tight as cannabis people are. Cannabis is still packing plants in pretty tight, and they've solved this problem in a different way by adding a lot more light rather than thinning out the plants in some cases, which is kind of cool. But I think what you noticed was probably the common thread here that was going on. So what do you think the practical takeaway is for a grower when you're looking at this example from hops?
I think you can get more with less, I guess, by packing less plants in, allowing more light, allowing the plant to capture the light more efficiently, getting some of those bottom nugs. Just because you're getting necessarily more biomass, or you get more leaves under the light footprint, you're not necessarily getting as much production. I think a concept called like leaf area index is something that's kind of coming out. It's well studied in other species, and I just don't think they have as much data in cannabis, but that's a concept that I think people could pay attention to. It's really just determining what is the maximum amount of leaf area that you need in order to produce your end product efficiently. Common sense says I just want to capture all those photons that my light's putting out. I want to stick as much biomass under that as possible. And that might be the case, but there is a limit to that. The plant can only absorb so much and produce a product efficiently. You might be able to grow and do photosynthesis, but you're not going to be able to get something that is, cost effective and worth your time, I guess, growing.
It becomes clear when you learn to think about the plant mass not just as producing, but also as consuming energy. And plants, like everything else, have limited resources. And at a certain point, different tissues of the plant can become net consumers of resources rather than net producers of resources. And anytime that balance shifts for an area, then the plant would be better served without that tissue anymore. I think what you're getting at here is really important, and focusing on having as much plant as you can where it's net productive material and trying to limit the amount that's consuming more resources than it's producing. And you write about hackberry plants as well. And you write about them as being a Trojan horse. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so hackberries are the other plant that's commercially produced in Cannabaceae. And there is some texts like systematics going on and working out where exactly it fits in the family. But it's taxonomically similar enough where it most likely has similar defense mechanisms to cannabis. It's notoriously the kind of the worst infected plant in like a North American forest. I don't know if you've ever seen one in like a parking lot. They're a pretty common plant in horticulture. They have all kinds of like galls, and the leaves are usually pretty trash with insects. And I think every time I've walked by one, I've seen at least a couple thrip or something else on it. I guess I've seen them planted outside grows, and I think it's something that people could really look at when they're dealing with IPM. These plants are very similar to cannabis, and they're very common in horticulture and landscaping. I just think it's something to look into where you're kind of looking at not just what's inside your grow, but what's outside your grow. I mean, if you're having thrips coming into your building all the time, these plants that are right outside your door could be potentially a source of contamination or disease. While hackberries may be a little more resilient to some of these insects, our cultivated and domesticated cannabis plants inside might not be so have the defense mechanisms that a hackberry does necessarily. There are plants out there that behave similarly and have similar defense mechanisms. It's not just necessarily what you're doing inside. There could be some things outside too that could be contributing to some of the issues that you're having.
It sounds like another parallel that you were making here was that there's different sorts of ecological niches and strategies that plants can evolve into. And a similarity between hackberry and cannabis is the idea that the plants, rather than having a lot of built-in defenses, they tend to have less defenses, but grow really fast so that they can outgrow problems and get to maturation quickly. Is that kind of the parallel that you're seeing with hackberries?
They're a big woody tree. So you'd have to assume that like as being like a perennial plant compared to cannabis being an annual, that they're going to have more, I guess, defense mechanisms against, disease because they have to survive the winter. They're producing foliage year after year, whereas in cannabis, it's adapted just to die at the end of the season. So it might not be putting as much energy into some of these defense mechanisms like you would hackberry. While it might be a great plant to put outside in landscaping, it might not be good to have right outside your grow. You really have to look into the ecology of cannabis and like what is it adapted to do. And it's only adapted to really live for, 6 to 9 months. I know we have some cultivars that are bred to go longer than that, but your average plant is, really only adapted to live for so long.
You mentioned some really interesting things about how they talk to each other when they're being eaten. How does that work?
Yeah, so plants can communicate by kind of breathing on each other. In the early 2000s, they were doing some research on lima beans, and they found out that when they were getting eaten, the lima bean plants would produce a gas, and it would tell all the other lima bean plants around it to produce a specific other volatile compound that will attract a predator for what is eating it. So depending on if it's a, aphid or a caterpillar or something, it'll send out a chemical to attract like a predatory wasp or beetle or something like that to come to its defense. And this is facilitated by a chemical called jasmonic acid. They found that this jasmonic acid has a lot of the same response in a lot of other plants. They're finding out that it's very similar in cannabis too.
So at some point there was, I'm sure, lots of evolutionary pressure for the development of a system like this, where a plant that's being assaulted by some pest releases jasmonic acid into the air. And then animals that tend to eat that pest develop the ability to sense that, to know where to go to food. That is really cool. They're recruiting defenses from the environment around them.
Yeah, it's a concept called allelopathy. It's very common, and I mean, a lot of plants do this. I did research on a plant called garlic mustard. It's invasive in the Midwest, and I think we're just starting to kind of get the tip of the iceberg in cannabis and just what the implications are for that.
Yeah. And in terms of it relates to cannabis, this sort of obvious connection here is with terpenes.
Well, jasmonic acid is a terpene, actually. And I think it has a conjugate base called a methyl jasmonate. They're kind of the same chemicals, just depending on if it's in an acidic or a basic environment. But it is the chemical that produces like the jasmine smell. I just think that you just might not be able to like the human nose can't really detect it in the quantities when cannabis is like kind of putting it out. But yeah, there's some interesting studies going out on just like the impact on the stress response in cannabis and like what kind of implications that could have on other terpenes, because similar to lima beans, the chemical that is triggering the defense response is not the same chemical that the plant is going to produce to defend itself. In certain quantities with cannabis, you could see some increase in terpene production or something like that if there's heavy jasmonic acid or methyl jasmonate kind of floating around in the air.
So just take a moment to speculate wildly here, but do you think that there's some sort of way that cannabis growers can use these same concepts to intentionally trigger plant defenses or to produce more terpenes?
I think there is. I wouldn't say there's great data on it in the moment. I know there's some people doing research on it, but I've always speculated by, if you could somehow produce some volatile jasmonic acid and kind of, apply it to your plants, what kind of response that would have. The plant is creating this when it's usually damaged by either like, an insect biting it. So somewhere in the process, the cells are being broken and it's creating this chemical. And I think you could somehow regulate or kind of modulate how much of a response that you're initiating the plant by some, cultural practices. Like I've always wondered, cutting a leaf with scissors is a much cleaner cut versus ripping the plant. And when you rip it, you're creating a larger response for the plant to create more of these allelopathic chemicals. And you could see different responses. I mean, there's some plants that, depending on what's eating it, it changes their terpene profile. Like if they have insects eating it, it's going to be a much cleaner cut, and you're going to have less of this jasmonic acid response versus a larger herbivore that is just taking this massive bite out of the plant and damaging more of the tissue. That's going to have a larger response. So depending on the type of response it's getting, it could potentially produce a different terpene composition to, I guess, ecologically, it would be to ward off certain predators, but humans could use this to kind of push the same strain and, getting different flavors with the same strain.
So you also compare cannabis trichomes to tomato trichomes, which I didn't know tomatoes had trichomes. What's the difference and why does it matter to us?
There's a lot more research on tomatoes, and you could use the same concepts that tomato farmers potentially use to increase the aroma or smell or defense mechanisms in tomatoes, and you could apply those to cannabis. And yeah, like they have a very similar anatomy. Tomatoes produce all the same kinds of trichomes. There's 3 different main kinds of trichomes plant produce. There's ones that are kind of more of like kind of softer hair. Usually it's produced to kind of defense against like UV light. There's some that produce more of like rigid hairs, and usually that's to produce a defense against insects or small mites crawling on it. And then they have glandular trichomes, just like cannabis, that produce oils and give them that kind of smell. But I know some people that are trying to do some breeding projects with cannabis to produce multi-capitulated trichome heads, where right now they just produce one large head, but I know some people that are trying to breed to produce multiple heads. And if you look at an analogy to tomatoes already produce a, multi-head trichome. And if you look at some like scanning electron microscope pictures of tomato trichome heads, there's actually 4 per stalk. So it just has some really cool implications on potentially, the hash community and people that are doing solventless, that, you could be getting more hash per, square foot of canopy potentially if, we look into that and, what mechanisms, allow tomatoes to do this and, apply them to cannabis.
Potentially there's some gene that's sitting around somewhere and maybe just switching out a couple of base pairs or something like that. And you get a strain that produces multiple heads on a trichome. That would be really cool. And I can imagine that whoever finds out how to do that first would have a bit of a golden ticket, especially with the hash and extract crowd. Yeah, that'd be really cool.
I think that's the next frontier. I know a lot of people in the community are kind of resistant to like genetically modified plants, but I mean, it's kind of the way of the world. There's more implications to kind of the whole GMO conversation. I think that you could do it more like ethically and still get some really cool results. And that's something that I'm kind of looking forward to in the future with cannabis.
Yeah, yeah. I happen to be in the camp that's I've been fully persuaded of the benefits of genetically engineered plants, and I'm like 100% on board. I think it's actually really hard to find any real example of genetic engineering to a plant that's created a bad outcome. The good outcomes are really amazingly good, and the bad outcomes are just like, oh, this plant doesn't work. But a few of my favorite examples is you can now get genetically engineered tomatoes that have a gene from snapdragons inserted into them. And this gene causes the interior flesh of the tomato to be like a vibrant dark purple all the way through. And they are so cool looking. And it does this by inserting a gene for producing anthocyanins. Not only do you have a tomato that looks beautiful when you cut it open, but it also is much higher in a bunch of the important physiologic compounds that produce good health for us. So it's kind of a win-win situation there. I've grown these and they're really sweet. And my other favorite genetically engineered plant from recent history is you can get petunias that have a gene inserted that causes the flowers to glow, to bioluminesce a little bit. So as long as it gets enough light during the day, at night, the flower petals themselves glow. I think it's a gene from a mushroom, actually. I can't remember specifically right now. Yeah.
There's a enzyme called luciferase, and I think they've isolated it from fireflies, and I want to say plankton and like bioluminescent plankton. And yeah, when I was in school, there was a biotech company out of Madison, Wisconsin that was working on doing this with like some trees. There was like some hedgerows and potentially doing some, natural lighting in parks where when the light goes down a certain enough, it activates this gene to start producing light on its own. And luciferase is the enzyme that does it. It's used a lot in like biotech for like to tell if a gene is on or off. They'll attach it to another gene so they can kind of do more research on it. But yeah, there's some exciting stuff. Genetically modified organisms get a lot of a bad rap, but there is some cool stuff that is done with it. And I think a lot of the time, or some of the time, you see actually like the genetically modified organism is actually more nutritious, I guess, in plants in this case, but you actually get more nutrients from genetically modified plant than you do maybe the organic. It's a case by case scenario. I know there are some organic crops that are more nutritious, but I know like corn is an example. Genetically modified corn is more nutritious than the organic counterpart. So just keep an open mind, cannabis community. It's there's some cool technology. It's not all bad, and yeah, there's some cool stuff that'll be coming in the future.
Yeah, I mean the classic example is golden rice, which is just regular white rice that has a gene inserted into it that causes it to produce more vitamin A in populations that have to subsist largely off rice and kind of low micronutrient diets. By getting them golden rice where they're getting more vitamin A in, it prevents blindness in millions of people, which is the result of severe vitamin A deficiency. So I think that's pretty cool. My other favorite genetically engineered organism is you can get protein powder that's made from a yeast that has the gene from cows that produces whey protein inserted into the yeast. And then you just have bioreactors filled with this yeast and it produces pure whey protein without needing to have an animal or a cow. And it's bioidentical to the whey protein you'd get out of milk, but requires no animals. So it's much more efficient in terms of water, feed, space, and energy. So you can buy this protein powder. I've been having it for years and I love it.
Yeah, no, it's, a lot less carbon. And I know insulin, if you're a diabetic, you've been getting insulin from a genetically modified organism since I don't know exactly when that was discovered, but it's been a long time, and humans have derived a lot of benefits from genetically modifying organisms over time. And I mean, traditional breeding is the same thing. It's just a lot longer of a process. And yeah, exactly. And then tying back to cannabis, I mean, people are already starting to do this by identifying certain genes that produce the effect they want, and it speeds up the breeding process a lot. You know, you don't have to grow a plant up all the way to see the result. You can just germinate a seed, do a genetic analysis on it, and then determine if that one has the gene or not. And then you can really speed up your breeding projects with this. And I know there's a couple companies that are doing that. I think they're getting some significant results.
Are there other crops that you're looking into that didn't make it into your writing so far? Anything you think is interesting to particularly look at?
Maybe not crops. There's just some examples from ecology that I know. I met some people doing research in like evening primrose, for example, on just how the terpenes can change depending on what pollinators are present in the environment versus what herbivores. Kind of going back to what I was saying, where depending on some of these, physical or chemical pressures or just, cues they're getting from the environment can really, kind of have like an impact on what terpenes they can produce. And I think that's something that's really fascinating because, if we really learn more about this, you could make your cut of a strain exceptional. For example, if you're growing like a trop cherries or something like that, yours, if you do certain cultural practices, you could have one that is really a tart cherry compared to a floral cherry or something that is kind of, more unique. And yeah, I just think that concept's really interesting and just like how we can apply it to cannabis. I know Eastern hemlock is similar to whether or not like a rabbit or a white-tailed deer is eating it, it'll start to change its terpene composition to kind of get the best defense in the environment with the predators that are present.
For me, I'm all in for the bioluminescent cannabis flowers. So
yeah, that would be cool.
Sign me up when that hits the market.
Right. Yeah. Maybe I don't know. Maybe it'll cause some of your plants to herm or something like that. And
Right.
they're too bright or something like that. Yeah, for sure.